All right, did you find that difficult? What? Yes? Well, then let's go over it, all right? So the first thing that you were asked to do was to create global constants. Hopefully no one found any problem with that. So the idea is, here's all three of mine, but in all three cases I did this. Does that make sense? Now I saw with at least one of you, you put like in a default miles and a default gallons, which would have been fine. It doesn't really matter. All right. But that should make sense to everyone, that the minimum number of miles we said somebody could travel was 1. The maximum miles they could travel, this was on a tank of gas, would be 1,000. The minimum gallons that they could use would be 1. The maximum gallons they could use would be 100. So maybe it's a truck, all right, type of thing, because most cars, of course, don't have a 100-mile gas tank. I get that. All right, so that was the first thing. Good variable names was the second thing. So, miles driven, somehow I lost my word var, but it was in there. Miles driven. Oh, this is the, okay. Gallons used, okay. And for some reason, I'm looking here and it says that this is version 1, but it doesn't look like it is. Okay, but we'll look at it anyway. All right. So really version 1 of this, like I said, I don't know exactly what happened here, but that should have been a var, miles driven equals. Not even going to worry about for right now. Let's get rid of this. All right, so that would be the miles driven. This would be the gallons used. All right, and again, we won't worry right now about validating. And that would have been figuring out the MPG. Does everybody get that? I'm asking, because if you don't, this is the time to say something. All right, so this is going to literally, so notice what we have here, because the mistake most people make is if you look, we have 2 left parentheses, so you must have 2 right parentheses. And the bad thing about JavaScript is if I leave off one of these right parentheses like this, and if I save this, and I go in and I run my index, nothing happens. Now, if you say, well, how do I get it to work then? You'd have to go in and you'd have to debug it. So you say, well, we don't really go over debugging until like chapter whatever. So one thing to do is if you've started to write this, so let's say that you did this. You wrote everything. I'm not worrying about the validation, but you did all this and it didn't work. And for the life of you, you cannot figure out why it didn't work. All right. Well, like I said, the first thing you should do is if you look here, you can see if you do use Notepad++, if you highlight this, you'll see there's no matching right parenthesis. All right. Whereas if I highlight this one, boom. All right. Now I can see if I highlight this one, it says that one matches. So I'm going to put that back in. All right. But I'm going to leave out the second one. So I'm just going a little further. So now notice if I go back and I run this, still not showing me anything. All right, well, geez, what the heck is the problem? Well, then what you have to do, and this is really the way you should write this stuff, is you should come back then and you should comment everything out. I mean literally everything until the end of the program. All right, so just that curly is the only thing not commented out. So now I'm going to save and I'm going to run this again. Well, I know that worked, correct? I'm not worried about validating it, but I know that worked. Doesn't matter what I put in here. Program ends. So I know that what's in here works. I know that. So I'm going to go and I'm going to go out to right here. And again, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to do that. So I know this works already, so now I'm going to check this. So again, I'll save it, come back, run. So now I know by the way I've been debugging this that the error must be, all right, it must be somewhere in here, correct? All right, so I know that. So I start looking through it and I say, okay, well, let's just say I couldn't, for the life of me, couldn't figure out it was a parenthesis problem. All right, so I could come in here, I could always do this. I could take that out. All right, I took out the prompt. So I'm going to run this again. Now it asks me, boom. Now it's not asking me anything else. It'll keep asking me if I run it, but it's only asking me how many miles did you drive. It's not asking me. So I know something is wrong in the second part of this. I know there's got to be an error in here someplace. I don't know what it is, but I know there must be an error in there. So I look and I say, well, this one had that parse float in a prompt, so I'm going to go back and add that. All right, and that one had 2 parentheses on the end, so I'm going to go back and add that. All right, now let's see if it works. Now notice that my parens, there's a beginning and an end. There's a beginning and an end. All right, so I'm going to save that, come back one more time, and run it again. It asked me that. It asked me that. Well, now I know both those worked. All right. So now I can come back in and I can grab this line about the miles per gallon and I can uncomment that. In fact, I'll uncomment everything. All right. So now I come back in here, run the program again. Oops, not that one. 300 miles. 20, and it worked. Well, that's good, but the problem is if I run it again and leave these blank, I get that, which you were told you were not supposed to do. All right, so now I know that I've got to go in and I've got to do my validation. But the point here is, all right, the reason that I'm showing it to you like this, write a little code, test it, write a little more code, and test it. In much the same way, the first thing that we were supposed to check for in here was not a number. So while is NaN miles driven. So I know in this case if I put something in that was non-numeric. All right. Well, I'm just going to do this again. Bless you. All right, so I'm going to put that again, but first thing I'm going to put in here is a message. Invalid input plus, we'll put a \n in here. Oops, it's got to be within the curlies or the double quotes. All right, so I've got that. All right, so now I come in, I run the program again, and I put something non-numeric in. Well, it's catching it. Invalid input, right? That's good. So as long as I keep putting in something that's not, that's invalid, it'll take it. The problem is we said that the confines of our requirements said that the minimum number of gallons you could put in was 1. Or I'm sorry, the minimum miles driven was 1, the maximum miles driven was 1,000. So if I put in negative 555, the program takes it, and it's giving me a negative amount. So I know that's wrong too. All right, so I've got to come back in here again, and I've got to add my other stuff. And you know how to do this now, and we talked about it some more today. We don't want to just check is not a number, but we also want to come in here, and we also want to check here, or can somebody tell me, what do I want to put in here? Come on, there's 2 checks. You all know this. All right, you're right, and that's one of them. So the other one is basically going to be the same thing, except we want to say greater than, and we want to say max miles, and not min miles. Do those checks make sense to everyone? So now when I come in here and I've saved this, if I come in and run it, it's always good to make sure that well, something's wrong. What's that? Didn't close my while loop? Okay. I like to say when I do stuff like that, yeah, I did it on purpose to see if you were all watching. No, I didn't. All right. Well, we got this. We got this. Oh, that doesn't have a matching one. See that? So I've got this and this, these two, bless you, these two. So I need that. I was missing a right parenthesis. So let's try to run it again. Does it work when I leave it all valid? That's good. That's good. Yep. All right. Now what happens when I run it again and I put in nothing here? Invalid input. It asks me again. Now what happens when I put in my negative 55? Invalid input. All right. What happens when I put in 1001? Invalid input. So that makes sense. All right. Now it's up to you as far as how you want to do this. But now that I know that I've got this and I know that works, I can come down here, copy all this, plop it in over here, but I'm going to have to make changes, of course. But I'm just going to grab all of it that I did in here. And, hey, nobody said this? Remember that var miles driven? This should not have the word var there. See that? Right there? I've already declared that variable. It should look like this. All right, so I'm just going to grab everything that was in there. I'm going to paste that in. So everywhere that I've got a miles driven, I've got to change it to gallons used. And instead of min miles, it'll be min gals, etc. And I'll have to change this to how many gallons did you use. And what do we want to put in there? 25? I don't know. So now with all that, unless I made a mistake, which is possible, if I run this again, well, I already know that it handles invalid input. So that's invalid. That's invalid. That's invalid. So it handles that. All right, now let's try our gallons. Nothing? That's invalid. All right, less than 1? That's invalid. More than 100? That's invalid. So if I come back and use that, now it worked. So the idea behind this first one that was in here was that we're putting everything in main. I literally went to the trouble of doing this. You didn't have to do that. You weren't asked to. So this is version 1. It figures out miles per gallon is miles driven divided by gallons used. In its first iteration, all code will be put into main. Again, this is our hierarchical input processing output chart. So our inputs were miles driven and gallons used. Our outputs were miles driven, gallons used, and MPG. We prompt for our miles driven and get it. We prompt for our gallons used and get it. We calculate our MPG, and then we display, no, this should have actually said display miles driven, gallons used, and MPG. And then here's the pseudocode. I declared the variables, prompt for the miles driven and get it, prompt for the gallons used and get it, validate the miles driven, validate the gallons used, calculate, print everything out. Any question on any of that? Because what we're going to build toward is eventually we're going to have a form. All right? That form will have in it two labels and two text boxes. One label will say, enter miles driven, and then there'll be a text box for that. Then another label that'll say, enter gallons used, and there'll be a text box for that. Then there will be two buttons, a button that says calculate and a button that says clear. If you click the calculate button, it'll do the calculation and it'll print that out on the screen. And if you do the clear, it'll clear out all the fields. And we'll do that by using event listeners that we will add to our code. Right now, we're just using JavaScript as we'd use any other programming language. Does that make sense? All right. So again, any questions on anything in here, anything I did, why I did it, or whatever, anything? A little easier to see. And again, I could have put all this stuff that you see here on just one line. All right. But I broke it up into multiple lines so you could see it, and ideally so you could understand the logic a little better. And the alert, remember with that, to two decimal places is the two fixed. All right. Like I said, you're going to be probably amazed when you get your test on Friday how close your test is to this. And if that's the case and everybody gets it done in an hour and I get 8 100s, I have no problem with that. All right, then let's look at the second one.
Can you keep that up for a second?
Yep. For the second one, what we were to do is to break this up into functions. All right, so hopefully, and I'll come right back, but if you look on the screen here, hopefully you all realize, okay, I declare all my stuff. This would be one function. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. This would be one function. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. This would be one function. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. And then finally, this would be one function. Does all that make sense? So instead of integrating everything together and putting it all inside of main, where we just have one function, main will now act as a driver. And main will literally call input miles driven, input gallons used, calculate MPG, and display all info. Something like that. Does that make sense? That's the way that most applications are written. Okay?
Is there supposed to be a bar before MPG?
Right here? I thought we did it up above, didn't we? Nope. You're right. Then it should have. Yes, for completeness. Now, there's also a school of thought over this. Many books will tell you, always declare your variables at the top of the program or at the top of the function. That's really not a bad idea. So I could have come up here and I could have set up here, var MPG equals 0 up there, which wouldn't have been a bad idea to do that. But yeah, that's a good catch. Any other questions on anything that's in here? One thing that does show is it still worked even without the word var in there. All right, but it's considered poor programming practice. It works, again, because JavaScript is a loosely typed language. If you tried this in C# and you tried working with a variable before you declared it and gave it a type, program is just going to break. You're going to see that next semester. It's going to happen to all of you. We all forget to do it. All right. Any other questions on anything that's in here? Does everybody who needs it have it? All right, then let's jump over and look at, it says for iteration 1, we just did. All the code was in main. Now it's iteration 2. Main will act as a driver with each input, calculation, and all outputs, each in their own function. So if we look at iteration 2 here, notice I've taken my constants, moved them outside of main. It is definitely considered an acceptable practice to make constants global in any kind of programming language. And the reason for that is they're never going to be changed because they're constants. So that's considered okay to do that. All right, so that's what I did. Now, main, as it says, it's now a driver. So notice what main does. Now I am declaring those variables. I could have literally said var miles driven equals this, etc., but this is probably a easier practice to look at and understand. So this, what am I doing right here? I'm doing two things. Declare and initialize program variables. Does everybody get this? Please look up on the screen. Right there, that you see in gray. That's a variable declaration. This is a variable initialization. If I leave that off, if I just put var miles driven, semicolon, what value then does miles driven have? Undefined. It would work fine here because I'm not trying to print it out. But it's never considered. Some programming languages, if you don't initialize a variable, some programming languages will automatically initialize numeric variables to 0 for you. They'll automatically initialize Booleans to false. They'll automatically initialize strings to the empty string. Some languages do that. Then you get languages like Java, not JavaScript, Java, that are a little weird. Sometimes it does it and sometimes it doesn't, depending on where you declare the variables. So that's all the syntax of the language and the way that the language itself works. All right? But you see that other than declaring and initializing these three variables, this is a true driver. Do you all notice that for this routine and this routine, for input miles driven and input gallons used, neither one of those routines require a parameter? See that? Calculate MPG needs to know the miles driven and it needs to know the gallons used. So it needs those parameters. Since those variables are no longer global, we must pass them from one routine to the other. And same thing in here. Now, what's the difference between, I know they're two different functions, and I know they have different stuff passed in, but what's the major difference between line 57 and line 58 between those two functions? What is the difference? Yeah, but what does that mean? The equal sign means this must return a value, so we can stuff it into MPG. This one, since there's no equal sign, it's not returning a value. So the last one will either not have a return statement or it will have return semicolon. Does that make sense? Because other than that, you know these already. This is the same thing we just did. Now, since we didn't pass a value in, if you look up on the screen here, since we didn't pass a value in, we have to return a value, so I declared a local variable in here. I just called it MD for miles driven. And then I set that this stuff that's in here, this, everything that you see there in gray is exactly what we did in the previous iteration, except there we used the word miles driven instead of MD. But this is our local variable, so we have to return it when we're done. Let's pretend for a second we don't want to do that. Are you all with me? We don't want to do that. So what I'm going to do, let me save this, is I'm going to go back here, and sometimes it looks weird to people to do this, but I'm literally going to pass miles driven right in to the program. See that? So I've got miles driven here and here. It's both what's going to be returned and it's the parameter that I'm passing in. Both. Then I've got to go back in here and I've got to put in, I can still say MD. It'll still work fine. But now I don't declare an MD variable. I've already passed it in. So notice if I do it like that, this should still work just fine. Still works. But the difference between the two is when we did it the first time, we did not put a parameter in here. Since we did not put a parameter in there, we had to declare a local variable with that name and then pass back the value of that local variable. You'll notice that still works too. Oops, not like that, it won't, but. So that works just fine. So is there an advantage to doing it one way as opposed to the other? Again, some people find that both passing in a variable as a parameter and returning that one is confusing. If you find it confusing, then do it the way I did it. If you like it better the other way, then do it the other way. They're both accomplishing the exact same task. So it really doesn't matter which way you do it. And I will tell you, I've said this to people before, and sometimes people get surprised over this, but all kidding, etc. aside, if you get a job as a programmer, the chance of anyone, when you're working on something, actually going over and saying, Matthew, why did you do it like this when you could have passed that in with miles driven, then you wouldn't have needed a local variable? Most of the time, people aren't going to ask you that. All right? It depends on the size of the company that you work for. My first programming job, I worked in a company that employed about 6,000 people. So the department that I was in had 75 people in it. So the first time I ever had to do my own programming, I had to literally write what was called a design document, which explained everything I was about to do, and it explained every test I was going to run to make sure that my new code would work and my new code wouldn't break any old code. You say, yeah, that sort of makes sense. Anybody want to take a guess at how long my design document was? 500 plus pages. And out of those 500 plus pages, about 400 were the different tests I had to run. Each test had to be on its own page to make sure I didn't break anything. In fact, that was probably about 450 to 475 of the 500 pages. And then I had to pass that document out. The people who were going to review my document had 2 months to look at it, and then we all got together. If they had a question during the interim, they could email me and say, why did you do this? All right. But then we all got together. And I worked at other companies where literally they said, do this. How do I know when I'm done? Well, you're going to give it to the customer. They're going to test it. And if they like it, you're done. So they were almost polar opposites of one another. But whether I was at AT&T or when I was at Woodward Governor, when I was programming for them, all right, my boss never came up and said, what are you doing and why are you doing it that way? There is really no code police typically. So the way that you do things is the way that makes the most sense to you. Now, if you go to work for a company that's real-time sensitive, so in other words, if you go to work for a company where you need to get answers back and they need to come back like that or they're no good, then you might write something like that both ways, test it, literally hook it up to what's called the system clock, which is just the clock here, find out which is faster, and do it that way. If I'm writing a payroll program, does it really matter if I'm doing a payroll program for a company of 10,000, whether it takes 36 seconds or 41 seconds? Not really. If I write it so it takes 41 seconds, but the code is much easier to understand, I've actually probably done a better job. All right. And again, what you see in here, I put not a lot of documentation, but some. This is called typically a function prologue. You put it at the beginning of the function to explain what the function's going to do. All right. Also, each variable that's in there, I put a comment there. All right. This is literally called the priming read. That's reading the first time. If it doesn't work, but either way, I've got to validate. So notice I even put checks in here that says that is doing my non-numeric, that is doing my out of range low, that is doing my out of range high. All right. And again, maybe I went a little nuts here with the documentation. I wouldn't even say I have not. All right. But as you're learning, it's much better to err on the side of caution and put in way too much documentation. And for your first year as programmers, not just this semester, but next semester, you should strive for understandability and readability. Not that, hey, Andrew, did you know this thing you wrote in 8 lines? You could have written it in 2. Yeah, but it would have been harder for me to understand and other people to understand. All right? If you do go to work for a bigger company, and there are shortcuts like plus, plus, etc., and you don't use them, people will find a way to let you know. All right? I had that because I didn't know some of that stuff existed, and I had people call me out on it, and say, hey, why didn't you do this? Gee, I didn't know you could do that. Okay, so I changed it so I could do that. Any questions on this one? So again, the gallons used is pretty much the same thing, except I have the local variable, and other than that, this is basically the same thing I wrote before. And remember, right here, since we're not passing in a variable, let's go back to the way we did it before. This was miles driven. Oops. And then in here I called it MD, right? Okay. So this parameter right here, this one that you see right there, that is called an actual parameter because it's actually declared up above. Actual parameter. Down here, this is called a formal parameter. You can name formal parameters and actual parameters the same thing. You are not required to in any language that I know. Could there be someone when you're required to do it? It's possible. I don't know of any, but it's possible. And again, since we are stuffing this into something, notice that there's a return here. Since we're stuffing this into something, notice there's a return here. And notice since we're stuffing this into something, there's a return here. But with the last one, since we're not stuffing it into anything, there is no return statement. Now, again, it's what's considered to be superfluous, but it would be totally legit to have typed in this. You can do that. Most people don't do it. There are languages, I believe the C programming language still requires you to do that. What you're going to learn next semester and the following semesters after that is sometimes when you do this, you put the return, what's called the return type in there. So not in JavaScript, so this would break this. But here I want to return a double. So I'd have to say here, double, meaning that that's the kind of variable that I'm returning. We don't do that because, again, JavaScript is a loosely typed language. So what about this one, Jeff? You're not returning anything. Then you put in the word void, meaning that it is void of a return value. All right? But again, with all that stuff, it literally just depends on the language you're using. And what I'm trying to get across to you is whether you do it the first way that I showed you, all right, or you do it this way, it doesn't matter. So whether I have this out of here and this out of here, or I put them both in, does not matter. It's whatever way is easiest for you to understand, that's how you should be doing it. All right, one more time, I'm going to run it just to make sure I didn't break anything. So I should always go back, check my non-input, yeah, there's an error. Check my out-of-range input, yeah, that's an error. My low out-of-range input, that's an error. And then try it, boom, that worked. How about that? Yep, that's an error. Yep, that's an error. Yep, that's an error. That worked. Good. Everything appears to work. All right? Every time you are running a program, in essence, you're testing it. Does that make sense? You might have run a program for years and years and something goofy happens and now it doesn't work. And I don't want to bore you, but I'm going to give you a very quick, honest to God story. My older brother Dick For years, he worked as the comptroller for an air filter corporation in Milwaukee called AirSam. And they used this product that interfaced with their database and allowed them to enter in records, etc., change records, remove records. One day, one of the secretaries was reaching for a book that was up above her computer. She reached for it, and when the book came down, it hit her keyboard. It sounded like a big thing, right? Except it hit some weird key combination, and it removed a bunch of records from their database. They didn't know it until the next time they tried to work with that customer, and it's like, where the hell are these records? That was testing the program because some weird keyboard combination got hit that they didn't account for in the software they were using. Now, they were lucky because every day they backed up their database. Every day. So they lost, basically they were able to restore it because they figured it out the next day. They restored the database and then they had to put the changes back in again, and this time they didn't drop anything. Right? But that kind of stuff does happen. Any questions on that second iteration? Anything? All right. Then let's get rid of that one. Then, the third iteration. Again, have main act as a driver. So ideally, if you got to this point and you did this one, you didn't start from scratch. You copied everything in and just made the changes accordingly. All right? Now, I know that at least one of the groups, and believe me, I'm not yelling at you for doing it or anything, but the idea was, could you do this without looking at your old programs? All right? And you said, well, no, but that's why you are able to use your programs when you do the hands-on test. But I wanted there to be no pressure on it with this one. That's why I said try it without it to see how much you're recalling from this. After a while, this becomes pretty much second nature, whether you realize it or not. It really and truly does. So when we look at the last one, again, those are our global constants. That's the stuff that we had from before. This is the new stuff. There's nothing magical about the words keep going, again, and first char. Does that make sense? Nothing at all special about them. And because you might say, well, why did you call it keep going? Why didn't you call it continue? Well, what would have happened if I would have put in here continue? It turns blue. What does that mean? It means it's a key word. It means it already has a meaning to the language. So even though continue would make sense there, I can't use it if I want the program to work. All right? So these are just the words that I ended up using. This is my program continue variable. This is what I'm going to ask the user, do you want to run the program again? So I called it again. This is the first character that they type in when I ask them if they want to run the program again. All right? So, you'll notice, again, same stuff we had before. This time I didn't even, we should have had var there, right? Var. All right? But you'll notice here I didn't even declare them and initialize them. It is totally legit to initialize variables by calling a function when you declare them. It's totally legit. All right? And what's new then is what's in here. Again, equal prompt, so it'll say, why don't I need, I'm asking you this, why don't I need a parse int or a parse float there? Because you're not inputting a number. You should not use parse int or parse float if you're not inputting a number. And if you're inputting a number and you ask somebody their age, it really should be a parse int. If you're asking them how many hours they worked where they can work a portion of an hour, it should be a parse float. Does that make sense? So we asked them, do they want to run it again? Then what are we doing here? Just so you hear the term, you're going to hear this when we're in chapter 12 of this book, talking jQuery. This is something dot something dot something. That's referred to as chaining. C-H-A-I-N-I-N-G. We are combining different things together. We are chaining them together. In fact, if we were doing this in jQuery, I don't know if JavaScript would accept this like this, probably would, but you typically do it like that. And each time you add something to the chain, you put it on its own line. You don't have to do that, all right? But it's considered easier to read when you do that. So this says, whatever I entered in there, so if I type in YES, this is going to take the whole YES and uppercase it, but only grab the first character. So it'll all be just a Y. So I come in here and I say, if it's equal to Y, keep going as true, else keep going as false. Now, I'm going to put them on the spot, and it's not to criticize them. In fact, Colin found it. But he did this. He had up here, where he had his keep going, he had a little g right there. Right? And I don't remember if that was a little one or a big one. Was that a little one too? And he used the equal true, which is okay to do. All right? Not that it wouldn't be, but... All right? But then down here, he changed it and he used a little g. So remember what JavaScript does automatically. It created a new variable right there that wasn't called keep going. And even though he put in there, do you want to run it again? He put no, okay? He was not checking the right keep going variable. All right? In fact, in here, I guess these were lowercase, and then over here you made that uppercase. Am I right?
Yeah, those are.
So this was a big G. Here and here. So in both those cases, it made a new variable, keep going with a capital G. It never changed the value of the old keep going variable, so no matter what he put, that keep going was still equal to true. And it would keep running it and running it and running it infinitely. Does that make sense? Everybody does that. And I will tell you, this is all kidding aside, not when you're taking a test, but when you're not taking a test, if you are looking at your code and you've looked at it for more than a couple minutes and you're like, I know this error is right in front of me and I can't figure it out, the best thing to do, walk outside. Walk down to the lounge, get a soda, go to the bathroom, do whatever you have to do, and come back. It's amazing just leaving for a couple minutes how much that helps. All right? But if it's not a test and you're still having problems, so Jesse's like, I know that this is, it's really close. You ask the person next to you. And all kidding aside, this is no joke. It's a lot of fun to find other people's errors. It really is. And the good news is they can typically return the favor for you at some point or other. All right? But again, I go back to the same analogy I gave to you before about a mechanic. All right? If I go in and there's something wrong with my car, I'm not very mechanically inclined. But if I take it to my mechanic, he or she can just listen to it, boom. They know what it is right away. Why is that? It's practice, right? So a lot of times I can look at your code. Now, I didn't see Collins. He found it. All right? But I helped Tony. I think that we found it together. But it's just because once the best way to do this is to practice. And again, maybe I told you this, maybe I didn't. I remember the first real program I ever had to write was in a language that's not used very often anymore for new developments called COBOL. All right, Common Business Oriented Language. There's still 6 trillion lines of it out there, so it's not going away. But when I did my first program, it wasn't a big program, but I had all sorts of errors. I remember running it, getting 29 errors. All right, the guy next to me, Larry Brown, who ended up becoming a pretty good friend of mine, he ran his, boom, it worked, and he left. He was like, this stuff isn't hard. And I'm like, geez, maybe I'm not meant to do this. And I figured out the errors. It's a very different language. You have to put periods at the end of most lines, etc. I was missing some periods, that kind of thing. But the next time we had a program, I ran mine and I had like 3 errors. He had over 100 because it was a harder program and he'd never seen those errors before. He was like, geez, you know what I did wrong? And I knew right where to look. because of some of the errors. I said, yeah, you didn't, in this division up at the top of your program, you didn't put a period. So you put a period in there and went down from 100 errors to like 13. All right, that's another thing. If you're ever running a programming language, and you'll see this, not so much in here, but in other languages, where you get a listing of your errors, you're best off to go from top to bottom. Because a lot of times when you fix the errors on the top, they'll fix the ones on the bottom. All right, so you really should. You know, if I can tell that to you till I'm blue in the face, and you say, well, I'm not going to do that, then don't do it. All right, but you're going to find that over time that that's the way that it works. All right. So again, other than that, there was nothing that was different in here. This is exactly the same. This is exactly the same. This is exactly the same. And this is exactly the same. And I want to just mention one more thing. If you look at this, forgetting about the comments for a second, this whole thing is 1, 2, 3, 4 lines. And a lot of people would say, you know, Jeff, it's not even worth writing a function for really one executable line of code. But I will tell you that the newer Fandango languages that are out there that are like object-oriented, it used to be one of the first languages that I learned was the C programming language. It wasn't the first, but it was one of the first that I learned. So let's assume that I'm using C, and I've got to write a program, and it's going to have about 500 lines of code in it. Okay? Then with C, and again, this is a generalization, but normally I would have had 10 functions, 50 lines each. All right? If I'm writing the same program in a language like C#, I'm going to have 50 functions, 10 lines each. So what happens with newer languages is you write smaller functions, all right, but you write more of them. And again, why would you do that? Because it is much easier to go in and debug this and to figure out where something is. All right, and I may have told you this before. I don't remember if I did or not. But let's say that I've got a program where I ask you to enter in your first name, your middle initial, your last name, your address, your city, your state, your zip, and let's say your cell phone and your email. All right, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 pieces of information. Let's say the first thing was social security number. So I ask you to enter in 10 pieces of information. All right? If you're writing this the way you actually should be writing code, should be, I'm not saying would, but should be, that should be 10 different functions. Each one of these should be in their own thing, but that's not how most people code. They write one function and put all 10 things in there. Because that's the way most human beings do it. All right? And it's not that bad with 10 things, but imagine you had 100 things or more, and stuff like that happens. That's why you don't put everything in main, because sooner or later something will break. But again, if I'm writing this where I put again, ideally what I do then is if I'm going to write this, I comment out these 9 lines. Then I write my function to input the first name. And I do all that stuff, and I test the hell out of it. Then it works. Good. Then I uncomment this one. And I write another function to input the middle initial. And I do the same thing. See what I'm saying? Write a little code, test it, write a little more code. Don't write all of your code and then start testing it. And I can't say that. You might hear me say that, I'm sorry, 10, 15 times between this class and your next class and your following class. And guess what? A lot of you are still going to violate that rule. Do I ever do it? Yes, I do. All right? But I will tell you, as much as I could, I tried to write all 3 of these that way, especially the first one. Okay? It made a lot more sense to do it the way I just showed you. Not even worrying about the validation. Just worrying about being able to input the first value. Okay, fine. Now could I input it and would it handle non-numerics? Fine. Now could I input and would it handle non-numerics and out of range on the low end? Fine. Then input non-numerics, low range, and high range. Then I knew I had that one done. Then I did the same exact thing for my next field. And I knew that the logic was the same. It's just the variable names were going to change. That's how you become a better programmer. All right, again, I can say it and say it and say it. You're either going to do it that way or you're going to do it whatever way you're most comfortable doing. All right, any questions on any of these three? All right, so tomorrow when you get in here, you got the rest of the period to just start on the homework for this. But tomorrow when you get in here, I will have emailed you the test review. All right, we will go over that for about the first, however long that takes, 15 minutes or so. You saw the format for the test. The second one's already done. It's the same format as the first. There's 9 or 10 matching at the end. There's a couple true false at the beginning, and the rest are multiple choice. All right, I think there's 33 questions again. You get a free point. All right, and so if you get 30, instead of getting a 90, you get a 91. All right, so every question is worth 3 points. They're all weighted the same. Questions? All right, then the rest of the period is yours.